In a land blessed with golden sunshine and gentle rains, there was a beautiful village called Namoro. This village was like a painting brought to life. Fields stretched far and wide, birds sang sweet songs by the river, and children played happily beneath tall mango trees. The air was always filled with laughter, stories, and the smell of fresh food cooked over firewood. Life in Namoro was peaceful and full of warmth. Among the many children who ran through the fields and danced under the moonlight, one girl stood out. Her name was Nomsa. Her eyes sparkled like the evening sky, and her heart was as pure as fresh spring water. Her laughter sounded like music, and her smile could light up even the darkest day. Nomsa was the kind of girl whose presence brought joy to everyone around her. People often said she was born with a star's blessing. Nomsa was raised by her mother, Mari, a gentle woman known throughout the village for her kindness and the beautiful baskets she wove by hand. Mari was soft-spoken and full of wisdom. She raised Nomsa with love, discipline, and dreams of a bright future. But behind their warm smiles was a story of sorrow. Nomsa's father had died when she was only 9 years old. He was a good man, loving and strong, and his absence left a deep emptiness in their hearts. Yet, Mari held her head high and carried on, raising her daughter with strength and grace. Despite the pain of loss, life moved gently for Mari and Nomsa. They laughed, they shared stories, and they held each other close during hard times. Nomsa dreamed of growing up, becoming someone who would help her people, maybe even teach young children one day. She was hopeful, innocent, and full of life. But peace is delicate, like a clay pot. One wrong touch, and it can crack. Sometimes, the greatest dangers don't come with thunder. They come quietly, wearing a smile. And that's exactly how it happened. Evil didn't knock loudly on their door. It walked in softly, speaking sweet words and pretending to care. It came disguised as comfort, as protection. But behind that mask was pain waiting to strike. In the quiet corners of their happy home, a storm was slowly building. A storm that would shake Nomsa's life to its very core. She didn't know it yet, but her world was about to change forever. The laughter she once knew would soon be replaced by silence. The freedom she once enjoyed would be stolen from her little by little, and the dreams she once held in her heart would be tested by betrayal, cruelty, and fear. But even when darkness begins to fall, a small light always fights to shine, and in Nomsa's heart, that light would never die. This is where her story truly begins, a story of pain and courage, of love and betrayal, of loss and victory, a story that would be told for generations to come, because in Namoro, something was about to happen that no one could have ever imagined, and it all started with one man's smile that carried the shadow of evil. Not long after, a man named Jango arrived from the neighboring village of Kanzoro. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and a voice as smooth as palm wine. He spoke gently, smiled often, and brought baskets of gifts, yams, dried fish, even colourful wrappers for Mari. The villagers whispered that Mari was lucky, that perhaps fate had smiled on her. But Nomsa, she felt something cold behind his warm smile. There was something in his eyes that made her uneasy, something that didn't match his sweet words. Soon, Mari married Jango. The compound that once felt like a safe haven slowly turned into a place of fear. Jango moved in and immediately took control of everything. He wasn't just a husband, he became the master of the house. He decided when the lamps would be lit, how much food should be cooked, and even how Mari should run her weaving business. Mari, at first, tried to keep peace, but Jango's voice was louder, his shadow heavier. But it was Nomsa who suffered the most. The moment Jango laid eyes on her as a stepdaughter, a different side of him came alive. He began to treat her like she was nothing but a servant in her own home. She was forced to wake up before the cock crowed, fetching water from the stream far outside the village. Even when her legs were tired and her feet sore, she swept the compound until her fingers were raw from holding the broom. She pounded yams so often that her hands were covered in blisters, her muscles aching each day. Jango never spoke to her with kindness. Instead, he threw cruel words at her like stones. "You think you're a princess?" he would say with a mocking laugh. "A girl must learn to serve. Life won't pamper you." Mari noticed the change, but Jango always had a way of twisting things, making Nomsa look lazy or disrespectful. "She's just stubborn," he'd say. "I'm teaching her discipline." And slowly, even Mari's voice began to grow quieter. She wanted to protect her daughter, but she was also trapped in Jango's web of control and manipulation. Nomsa, once full of laughter, now cried quietly into her pillow each night. Her body ached from labor, her heart hurt from rejection, but her spirit, it refused to die. She kept her pain hidden beneath silence. When Jango shouted, she bit her tongue. When he insulted her, she lowered her eyes. But deep inside, she carried something he could never take, hope. She still dreamed, she still believed. And though her hands were calloused and her back sore, there was a fire burning quietly inside her. It was the fire of a heart that had tasted peace once, and knew it would taste it again. She didn't know when, and she didn't know how, but something in her soul whispered that her story was not meant to end in pain. And even as Jango tried to crush her light, Nomsa's heart held on to the promise of a better tomorrow, because love, even when buried under hardship, always finds a way to bloom again. One hot afternoon, everything changed again. Jango returned home with a visitor, a man named Bofani. From the moment he stepped into the compound, something about him sent chills down Nomsa's spine. Bofani was an older man, with a huge belly that bounced when he laughed, and teeth so yellow they looked like old corn. His eyes wandered too much, and his laugh was loud, crooked, and full of mischief. He was known in the nearby villages as a rich cattle merchant, always traveling with his guards and boasting about his wealth. But behind his riches was a reputation. He had many wives scattered in different towns, and none of them were truly happy. But this time, Bofani wasn't just visiting for business. He had come for something darker, something that had been planned in secret between him and Jango. While Nomsa served them water and quietly stood at a distance, she felt their eyes on her, and not in a good way. Later that evening, she walked past the back wall of the hut. Just as she heard hushed voices, curious and cautious, she paused, listening. What she heard nearly made her collapse. Jango's voice was cold and cruel. She's strong, untouched, obedient. You marry her, and will share profits from your next cattle deal. Bofani chuckled wickedly. Done, he replied, licking his lips. I'll take her after the next full moon. She'll make a good addition to my household. Nomsa's heart dropped. Her vision blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. Her body trembled. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Her own stepfather was planning to sell her like an item at the market, like a goat or a piece of cloth. And Mari, could she really allow this? With her legs shaking, Nomsa ran straight to her mother, falling at her feet, with tears streaming down her face. Mama, please, she cried. He wants to sell me, to that man, like I'm not even human. But Mari stood frozen, her face pale and her hands trembling. She looked away, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. Her voice cracked as she whispered, Child, we owe him. He paid for the farm tools, for my baskets. I can't stop him. Nomsa's world shattered in that moment. The one person she trusted most, her own mother, was powerless, too afraid to fight for her. Her tears flowed harder, but deep inside her chest, something started to grow. A fire of anger, of pain, of resistance. She knew she could not rely on anyone now. She was alone in this fight, but one thing was clear. She would never let herself be handed over to a man like Bofani. No matter what it took, she would find a way to escape this cruel fate. Because she was not a product to be sold, not a gift to be exchanged for profit. She was a person, with dreams, with a heart, with strength. And even though the world around her seemed to be turning against her, Nomsa's spirit was starting to rise. Something was about to change. And neither Jango nor Bofani had any idea of the storm that was quietly building in the heart of the girl they thought they could control. Fate, as always, had a way of writing its own story. In the same village of Namoro lived a young man named Toma. He wasn't rich, nor did he wear fine clothes, but his heart was pure and his hands were honest. He worked in the blacksmith's hut with his father, shaping iron with fire and sweat. But what burned even brighter in his heart was his quiet love for Nomsa. He had loved her from afar for years, ever since they were children chasing butterflies near the riverbanks. He had watched her grow, admired her strength, her kindness, and her quiet courage, especially during the days when Jango's cruelty became too hard to ignore. Toma noticed everything, the way Nomsa walked with heavy steps, the sadness hidden behind her forced smile, the way her eyes stared into nothingness sometimes, as if wishing for another life. He wanted to help her, to hold her pain in his own hands, but he didn't know how. So, he started with small gestures. He began leaving tiny gifts by her doorstep, simple things, yet full of meaning. A bunch of wildflowers tied with palm string, a small carved wooden bird, a smooth riverstone shaped like a heart. He left no note, no name, only silent affection wrapped in hope. Nomsa, at first, was confused, but slowly, those little gifts became the only bright moments in her days. They made her smile again, even if just for a moment. One day, after a long morning of pounding yam under Jangolo's harsh orders, Nomsa escaped to the stream to cry in silence. Her shoulders shook, her face buried in her hands. She thought no one was watching, but Toma was there. He had followed her from a distance, his heart aching at the sight of her pain. Gently, he stepped closer and spoke for the first time. "Your tears should never fall alone, Nomsa," he said softly. Startled, she looked up, and their eyes met, his full of warmth, hers full of sadness. In that single moment something shifted. The walls she had built around her heart began to crack. She didn't speak at first, but she didn't run either. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as a burden or a servant, but as someone who mattered. From that day on, their connection deepened. They began meeting secretly beneath the old tabari tree, a large tree near the edge of the village where the wind sang through the leaves and birds danced on the branches. There, away from the cruel eyes of the world, Nomsa could laugh again. She could talk freely, dream loudly, and feel safe. They shared stories of their childhood, dreams of a better future, and laughter that echoed through the night air. Toma would bring her roasted groundnuts, and she would braid little strings for his wrist. It was innocent, gentle, and powerful, something even stronger than the chains of fear and sorrow that had wrapped around Nomsa's life. Their love didn't need grand words or promises. It lived in their glances, in the way he held her hand, in the way she smiled at his jokes. It was quiet but strong, a seed that had begun to grow, even in the soil of hardship. And though the world around them was still full of danger, their hearts now held something beautiful, hope. The day everyone feared arrived like a dark storm. The village was filled with the sound of drums beating heavily in the air, but there was no joy in Nomsa's heart. It was supposed to be a celebration, but for her, it felt like a funeral. Elders gathered under the great palm shelter, seated in a circle with solemn faces. Some looked puzzled, others whispered among themselves. No one had heard of any courtship. No one had seen love between the two. But Jangolo had spoken, and in his presence, most people remained silent. Jangolo stood tall and proud, pretending it was a moment of honor for his household. He raised his voice and declared Nomsa's engagement to Bafani, the wealthy cattle merchant. Bafani arrived with his usual crooked smile, his robe brushing the ground, his rings shining under the sun. He looked at Nomsa like she was just another cow he had bought from the market. He didn't see the pain in her eyes, nor the stiffness in her body. Nomsa stood there, dressed in a dull cloth that made her look like a shadow of herself. Her face held no smile, her eyes held no light, and when Bafani placed the engagement beads on her wrist, her hands trembled. "Soon you'll call me husband," Bafani said with a smug grin, rubbing his stomach proudly, as if he had won a prize. Around them, some villagers shifted uncomfortably. A few old women shook their heads quietly. They could see this wasn't right. They could see the fear in Nomsa's face, but fear of Jangolo kept their lips sealed. No one wanted to be the one to challenge him. That night, when the celebration faded and the drums stopped, Nomsa sat alone outside her mother's hut, staring at the moon. Her heart was heavy, her soul crying silently. She knew no one would help her openly. She had to find another way. That's when she remembered the old story her father once told her, of how the river carried messages to those who listened. With trembling hands, she took a wooden gourd used to fetch water. Using a sharp piece of stone, she carved a desperate message onto it. "Help me. I am not a bride. I am a prisoner." She wrapped the gourd tightly, sealed it with a string of palm fiber, and in the stillness of night, walked to the river. Her eyes filled with tears as she dropped the gourd into the flowing water, watching it disappear into the darkness. She didn't know if anyone would ever find it, but her heart whispered a prayer. The next morning, fate answered. Toma had gone to the river early, hoping to catch fish before the sun grew hot. As he pulled his net from the water, something unusual caught his eye. The gourd. He picked it up, confused at first, but then saw the carvings. He ran his fingers across the message, reading each word slowly. His heart pounded like war drums. His eyes widened in shock. Nomsa needed help, and now he knew the truth. She wasn't just suffering. She was being handed over like a slave. Toma clutched the gourd tightly and looked up at the sky. This was no longer just about love. It was about saving the woman he loved from a life she didn't choose, and he knew he had to act before it was too late. Toma didn't waste a single moment. With the carved gourd still in his hand, he ran to the compound of his uncle, Elder Ndawi, a wise and deeply respected man whose voice still carried weight among the council of elders. As soon as he saw him, Toma knelt down and poured out everything. He told him about Jangolo's wicked deal with Bofani, the forced engagement, and most importantly, the love he and Nomsa had secretly nurtured under the old tabari tree. Elder Ndawi listened in silence, his face growing tighter with every word. When Toma finished, the old man rose slowly and said, "Marriage is not trade. A woman is not cattle. This must stop." The next morning, Ndawi walked straight to the chief's hut and requested an emergency council meeting. The news spread quickly. Something serious was happening. By mid-morning, the council of elders had gathered beneath the big fig tree at the village square. The air was heavy with curiosity and tension. Men and women came from every corner of Namoro, wondering what matter had shaken the elders so urgently. Elder Ndawi stood before them with authority. His voice was calm but sharp like a spear. "This village has always followed the path of justice," he said. "But what I have heard threatens to stain our traditions. A young girl, Nomsa, is being sold under the guise of marriage. Not with her consent, not with love, but with greed and secrecy. That is not our way." The crowd murmured in shock. Heads turned, eyes widened. Some couldn't believe it. "We must hear from the girl herself," Elder Ndawi continued. "Let her speak her truth." Jangolo, sitting among the elders with a proud smirk, suddenly shifted in his seat. He stood up in protest, raising his voice. "She's just a child. What does she know about love or truth? This is my household matter." But Elder Ndawi wasn't moved. "You have treated her like a burden, not like a daughter. You have no right to silence her now." Then Nomsa was brought forward, standing at the center of the gathering. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held her head high. The whole village watched as she took a deep breath. "I will not marry Bofani," she said, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "I was never asked what I wanted. I am not a price tag to be exchanged for cattle. I have a heart. I have dreams. I belong to no one except to the one who truly loves me." A wave of gasps spread through the crowd. Even the elders looked at each other in disbelief. This young girl had just spoken with the courage of a queen. Jangolo's face turned red with rage, but for the first time, he looked powerless. His secret plan had crumbled in front of everyone. People began to murmur openly now, some nodding in support of Nomsa. Others whispered shame about Jangolo's greed. Toma stepped forward and stood beside Nomsa silently. No words were needed anymore. The message was clear. Love had spoken louder than fear. And at that moment, the village of Namoro realized true love doesn't hide in the shadows. It fights, it speaks, and sometimes it changes everything. The sun rose brightly over Namoro, but the air felt heavy with tension. Jangolo, blinded by his pride and greed, had ignored the council's decision. He had paid off the village priest in secret and announced that the wedding would go on, whether anyone liked it or not. The village square, usually filled with songs and dances during celebrations, now carried a strange silence. Decorations hung from the trees, drums were set up, and Bofani stood proudly in front of the altar. He wore golden robes that shimmered under the sun and reeked of goat oil, grinning like he had won a prize. Nomsa was pulled from the house, dressed in white against her will. Her hands trembled, her eyes were full of tears, and her heart beat like a trapped bird. The villagers watched silently. Some were confused, some were angry, and others just looked away in shame, but no one dared to stop it. Not yet. The priest stood with his staff raised high, ready to bless a union built on greed and deceit. Bofani stood beside Nomsa with an ugly smile, licking his lips and adjusting his robe as if he owned her already. It felt like the world was folding in on Nomsa, her breath shallow, her soul crying out for a miracle. And then, it happened. A loud voice echoed from the edge of the square. "This is not love. This is evil." All eyes turned in shock. Toma had arrived, breathless and fierce, pushing through the crowd. He didn't wait for permission. He walked straight to the altar and stood between Nomsa and Bofani. The crowd gasped. Bofani stepped back in confusion, while Jangolo's face twisted in fury. Toma reached out and gently took Nomsa's trembling hand. "I love her," he said, his voice loud and clear, "and she loves me. You may call me poor, but I will never buy her like a cow." There was a moment of silence. Then everything exploded. People shouted, some clapped, some cheered. Even the elders stood up, nodding in approval. Elder Ndawi raised his staff and said loudly, "The boy has spoken from his heart, and the girl's silence speaks volumes. This marriage must stop now." Even Mari, who had remained silent for too long, found her voice. She pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. "My daughter will not be sacrificed," she cried. "I was weak before, but no more. Let my child live her life." Jangolo tried to argue, shouting insults, but his voice was drowned out by the crowd. Villagers turned against him, calling him greedy, calling him a disgrace. Even the priest, ashamed of his part, quietly stepped back and disappeared from the scene. Nomsa stood beside Toma, still shaking, but with a new light in her eyes. Her tears were no longer from pain, but from relief, from hope. In that moment, love had defeated greed, courage had silenced cruelty, and the village of Namoro, once shadowed by fear, witnessed the power of a heart that refuses to be broken. The air in Namoro was thick with tension, but also with hope. The crowd had seen enough. They had witnessed the truth with their own eyes, and now they demanded answers. Whispers turned into shouts. The people surrounded the village council, demanding justice for what had almost happened to Nomsa. The elders, now fully awake to Jangolo's evil ways, launched a deeper investigation, and it didn't take long before the truth began to pour out like rain. Jangolo could no longer hide. Under the weight of questions and public shame, he cracked. He admitted to everything, how he had stolen from Mari's weaving business, hiding profits, and using the money to fund his greedy deals. He confessed how he planned to sell Nomsa to Bafani in exchange for cattle and gold. He spoke of the threats he made to Mari, and how he bribed the priest to go ahead with the wedding despite the council's refusal. The village square, still filled with people, erupted in anger. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others shouted insults at Jangolo. The same man who once walked proudly through the village was now exposed as nothing more than a coward and a thief. The council didn't waste time. Jangolo was stripped of his status. He was thrown out of the council and ordered to leave the village immediately. His house was seized and returned to Mari, the rightful owner. For the first time in a long while, justice was served, but the storm wasn't over yet. Bofani, thinking he could still escape the consequences, pulled out a heavy bag of coins and tried to bribe the elders. "Let me go in peace," he said, sneering. But the people weren't fooled anymore. The elders refused his money. Instead, they fined him heavily, making him repay what he had offered for the illegal marriage. His name was announced in shame, and he was officially banished from Namoro. No one would trade or speak with him again. As the sun began to set, the village square turned from a place of conflict into a place of celebration. People clapped and sang for Toma, the humble blacksmith's apprentice, who had stood up for love and justice, and for Nomsa, the girl whose courage lit a fire in every woman's heart. Mari wept, this time not from fear, but from pride. Her daughter was safe, her home was hers again, and the chains of silence had finally been broken. A wise elder stepped forward and raised his hand for silence. His voice carried across the village as he spoke. "Let today be remembered forever. Love is not gold. Love is sacrifice. Love is protection. Love is truth. And today, love has won." Everyone cheered. Children danced. Even the trees seemed to sway in joy. And in that moment, the story of Nomsa and Toma became more than just a love story. It became a symbol of bravery, a lesson of justice, and a reminder that no matter how deep the darkness, the light of truth will always rise. Weeks passed, and peace returned to Namoro. The wounds left by betrayal slowly healed, replaced by whispers of hope and joy. The village buzzed with excitement once again, but this time for a celebration that truly came from the heart. Under the shade of the old tabari tree, the same place where their love quietly blossomed, Nomsa and Toma exchanged their vows. There were no gold ornaments, no grand decorations, and no loud boasts. Just simple flowers, joyful songs, and the blessings of the people who had watched their love grow. It was a modest wedding, but it carried more meaning than the richest ceremony ever could. The villagers danced with bare feet on the soil, singing songs of love, strength, and new beginnings. Children ran around with laughter, while elders nodded with pride. Even the wind seemed to hum along with the music. It was a day no one in Namoro would forget. Mari stood by, wiping tears of joy from her eyes. She looked at her daughter, not as a helpless girl, but as a woman who had fought for her voice and found true happiness. Her heart was finally at peace. She smiled brighter than she had in years, knowing Nomsa's life was no longer ruled by fear, but by love and purpose. Nomsa's eyes sparkled, not from jewels or riches, but from freedom. Her smile was full of peace. She wasn't just a bride that day. She was a symbol of strength for every girl who had ever been silenced, every daughter who had been treated like a burden. She had turned her pain into power and her story into a light for others. Toma, standing proudly by her side, knew he had not just won a bride. He had found a partner, a friend, and a purpose. Their love was real, built on honesty, not greed. Together, they held hands and began building their life from the ground up. They moved into a small house they built with their own hands, stone by stone, brick by brick. There was no servant, no luxury, but their home was filled with laughter, love, and warmth. Toma continued his blacksmith work, forging tools and fixing farming equipment for the village. He worked with pride, not for riches, but to serve his people and provide for his wife. Nomsa, now full of strength and purpose, started a small school beside their home. She gathered the young girls of the village and taught them to read, to write, to speak boldly, and to believe in themselves. She told them, "Your life is not a price tag. You are not a trade. You are a voice, a dream, a future." Mothers brought their daughters with hope in their eyes. Fathers, once silent, began to see the value of educating their girls. Slowly, Namoro changed, because one girl stood her ground and dared to say no. And so, love triumphed, not just between two hearts, but across a whole village. Toma and Nomsa's story became a lesson passed from one generation to the next, that no one should ever be sold, that true love is free, and that the strongest chains can be broken by courage, truth, and unity. Their journey wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in the heart of Namoro, under the tabari tree, love had truly won. Jangolo's fall was slow but certain. After being cast out of Namoro, he wandered from town to town, looking for someone to trust him again. But his name was already stained. People had heard of his greed, his lies, and the way he tried to sell his own stepdaughter like a piece of meat. No one wanted anything to do with him. He would stand by market gates, hoping for a little job or a bit of food, but traders would shake their heads and turn away. Slowly, his clothes faded, his shoes wore out, and the once proud man with a loud voice became just another beggar on the roadside. Some villagers from Namoro who passed him on distant roads would whisper, "Is that not Jangolo?" and shake their heads with pity. He had lost everything, not just his power, but his respect, his dignity, and even his name. As for Bafani, karma did not spare him either. The very cattle deal he promised to share with Jangolo turned into a disaster. The livestock he purchased were stolen on the road by bandits, and he lost every coin he had. His business crumbled overnight. His many wives, who had once stayed for his wealth, vanished the moment his pockets emptied. They packed their things and left him behind, one by one. He was left alone in his compound, coughing and weak, with no one to fetch water or bring him food. The man who once boasted and laughed loudly now spent his days groaning on a bamboo mat, sick and forgotten. The villagers in nearby towns started using his name as a warning to greedy men. Don't be like Bafani, whose riches could not save him from disgrace. But far away from their misery, Nomsa's life blossomed like a flower in the sun. She walked with grace and strength, her head held high, her heart at peace. She was no longer just the girl Jangolo tried to trade. She was the woman who fought back, who dared to speak, who showed the village that girls are not property. Her love story with Toma became more than just a tale. It became a legacy. Mothers told their daughters, "Be brave like Nomsa." Her courage turned into a song sung during village festivals, with drums beating and children dancing around fires. Her name became a symbol of hope, a reminder that truth will always rise, even when buried in silence. Nomsa's small school grew. More girls came. More fathers listened. More hearts changed. She didn't just change her own destiny, she changed the village's future. Every time a girl stood up in class and read her first sentence, it was another victory for Nomsa. Her voice echoed in every corner of Namoro, not with anger, but with wisdom, with strength, with light. And while Jangolo begged for scraps and Bafani coughed alone in the dark, Nomsa stood tall in the sun, with love beside her, freedom in her heart, and a legacy that would live far beyond her years. Indeed, karma had done its work. Those who tried to silence her were silenced by fate, and the girl they tried to break became the very fire that lit the path for others. If Nomsa's courage touched your heart, if you believe every daughter deserves a voice, then don't let this story end here. Share it with others. Your one share might inspire someone's life. Please like this video, share it with your loved ones, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful and emotional stories. Thank you so much for watching.